Welcome everyone to the inaugural episode of Inflection. And this started out as a talk between Angelo and myself weekly. And so we just decided to kind of formalize it into a weekly show. What we're going to do to start with, the beginning format is going to be, we'll do some headlines and then we'll have a main topic that we'll dig into. And we picked the name Inflection because this is about a changing trend. And we're both deep into studying this shift from unipolar to multipolar geopolitics. So I am a co-host, Brian Berletic, and this is Angelo Giuliano.
Hi, Brian.
Welcome. Yes, welcome, Angelo. And why don't we just start out with the headlines? Let's just get right into the headlines. So I think the top most important one would be the situation between Israel and Palestine. And let's just get this article up right here. This is from RT. UN Security Council calls on Israel and Palestinians to stick to ceasefire, stops short of condemning violence because of US. Angelo, why this started and ended very quickly, and a lot of people are noting that this is quite different than past conflicts. Why do you think that this was a bit different?
Well, I think the dynamic is very different this time. You know, when you look at the last bombings in Gaza, Netanyahu would not be influenced by whatever the Western media was saying. You know, he's just going his way. In this specific time, you saw yesterday 180,000 people in the streets of London. That's quite impressive. And I think we are in a momentum where the Palestinian movement is gaining some is getting the upper hands when it comes to PR. And I think it might be also one of the reasons might be that related to the disengagement of the US in the region. I mean, I don't think that the US wants to have more problems in the regions. They're trying to disengage a little bit, you know, from Afghanistan, Iraq, and I think it's not the right time. But it's very surprising. I was yesterday at an event in support of Palestine in Geneva, and it was just amazing to see so much support for the Palestinian cause.
Do you think it might also be what you said about the U.S. trying to disengage? Maybe it's the U.S. just kind of getting incrementally kicked out of the region because of their growing global weakness. Also, do you think that the alternative media might have played a role? The expansion and growth of genuine alternative media and the ineffectiveness of the corporate media that probably would have tried to sell us this conflict in favor of Israel years ago, but now maybe things have changed. Do you think things might have changed with the alternative media?
It's a very good question. I think, I'm a pro-Palestinian. You know my stance whenever it comes to Palestine. But I think somehow you have a movement, movement that are trying not to hijack, but they are influencing, they're trying to use this as a marketing tool. So you see Human Rights Watch, they're taking a strong stance for Palestine. And I think that, and the same, George Soros is actually funding pro-Palestinian movement. And it's just a way to say, well, see what we're doing whenever it comes to Palestine. The same with Western media. We are reporting what's going on in Palestine. Just trying to give us the impression that whenever it comes to human rights, they are consistent. So I think it's very dangerous. It's just dangerous. You see also AOC, the gang, Democrat gangs. It's who are funding BLM and starting to fund pro-Palestinian movements are the same. So we need to be very careful. You see, I saw also some flags, LGTB flags and so on. So we need to be very careful. There might be a little bit, some people or some institutions are trying to appropriate themselves this Palestinian movement. So it's very, for me, it's very scary when you have the Palestinians keeping on telling us, oh, human rights said this, human rights say this, and so on. They need to be extremely careful who they are quoting, who they are naming, really. So I think it's just a facade for now. So I think it's just an alarm. They need to be careful, you know, whoever is trying to fund them and trying to infiltrate them.
Yeah, and then I think because I think there is legitimate alternative media. I mean, we are alternative media, and we're supporting the Palestinian their rights to resist injustice against them. And but you're absolutely right. Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, some of these corporate media outlets, and just like what you said about AOC and the Squad, I mean, that's what they did. They took issues that were important to the American people, and they hijacked them, and they had no intention ever of actually serving the people and those interests. They were hijacking them, hiding behind them, actually delaying any meaningful addressing of these issues. So we have to be careful, just like you said, about Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and even the corporate media kind of worming their way into this legitimate resistance and spoiling it. Okay, let's move to the next one. Let's see. So one more headline. Lebanese attacked Syrian voters in sign of growing resentment. And actually, okay, this is mostly about different factions in Lebanon attacking Syrians who live there, who left Syria because of the conflict. But they're trying to get to the Syrian embassy to vote, and they're being attacked. But the thing that I actually wanted to focus on was down here. France and Germany banned any voting at Syrian missions in their country, with a French foreign ministry official saying the elections are null and void, and there is no point in holding them. So who is France, or Germany for that matter? Who are they to determine this about Syria's elections, and who are they to ban Syrians from voting in their own election at their own embassy in France or Germany? And I mean, could you imagine if Russia or China did this to nationals in their countries, trying to go to their embassy and do anything at their embassy? Or these are the two countries, France and Germany, who lecture the world about democracy and about how people should be allowed to vote. And even, actually, let's jump back to this article real quick. Actually, the UN was complaining about the factions in Lebanon trying to prevent the Syrians from voting, but they had nothing really to say, not that I know of, not that AP reported, about France and Germany blocking voters from voting. Isn't that strange? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I remember a quote. You know, there was a French foreign minister, Laurent Fabius. You know what he said on TV? He said, Al-Nusra in Syria is doing a good job. I mean, can you imagine this? I mean, Al-Nusra, a terrorist group, that's what he said. And it's explaining, when you say that, everything makes sense. They're not allowed, they want to delegitimize from the beginning. They try to delegitimize the Assad government, and they've been backing terrorist groups. So what are you expecting? They're trying to have some elections. They're trying to destroy, you know, and it's just hypocrisy.
And for people that don't know, Al-Nusra is Al-Qaeda in Syria. And back to that article, they also said that there needs to be a political solution. That's what they're waiting for. France and Germany and the United States are waiting for a political solution. And political solution is just code for regime change and the installation of a regime into power that suits the West and their interests, not Syria and the people their interests. And again, yes, President Bashar al-Assad is probably going to win the election. But that's because he and his alliances with Syria's allies and the Syrian Arab Army prevented Syria from becoming another Libya or Iraq or Afghanistan or Yemen. So we have to keep that context in mind. This is what Germany and France are still, to this day, 10 years after this conflict started, this is what they're signing on to.
Yeah, I just want to add something, Brian. You see, those colored revolution, those regime change, they need to happen very, very quick, because you need to gain a momentum. Because slowly what happens is that people, they start to realize that the manipulation and the interference. And so so in Libya, it was like extremely fast. Now in Syria, they realized that, this is terrorism, this foreign interference. It's not, it's not for democracy, it's not for Syrians. And so there was maybe before a legitimate opposition, but there was hijacked by foreign powers. And then you had all those warriors, like those mercenaries coming to Syria. So it's always about, can they get the momentum to create a revolution? Because otherwise, slowly what happens is that you have people like us that are actually exposing this foreign interference, and people start realizing, oh, you know what? We need to be careful, because the US, the same as what happened in Hong Kong, people started realize, oh my God, we've been manipulated. All this funding and so on, and then you have a shift. And this is what is happening in Syria. People right now, they just realize that what is most important now in Syria is to protect our sovereignty. Remember, part of Syria is still occupied. The oil-rich area, it's occupied by the US, and it's just there, like Trump said, it's like, I'm there for the oil. This oil, let's take the oil. What it has to do with democracy? Is it for the Syrian people? No. And you know what? Respect to Trump. At least he's honest. He's honest. He's there. I'm there for the oil. I'll keep enough military personnel there in Syria so I can pump the oil.
Yes. And I mean, honestly, I believe that the whole situation in Syria and the wider Arab Spring, the opposition groups and the militants were all being prepared years in advance for all of that. And it was all sprung at the same time. And I think despite all the planning, the years of planning and everything that they put in place beforehand, I think, again, it indicates waning power in the West. And could you imagine Russia back in the 90s or early 2000s intervening in Syria that way? That would be unimaginable. They would never have been able to pull it off. So this multipolarism emerging and unipolarism contracting worldwide. And you mentioned Hong Kong, which is a great segue into our main topic, which this week is going to be about the national security law in Hong Kong and kind of how it might be setting a precedent for the rest of Southeast Asia, because Hong Kong is not the only place plagued with these Western-backed protests. Protests across the region here in Thailand, now in neighboring Myanmar. If you look at the protesters themselves, they're not even trying to hide that they're all connected. They're all supporting each other across borders, meeting together, organizing together. So if the national security law was a potential solution for the situation in Hong Kong, maybe something like it could help other nations in the region suffering from the same sort of crisis. So I just want to ask you first, give us a little background about how bad it was in Hong Kong before the national security law was passed, what the national security law was entailed, and why was it so successful at basically stopping this movement completely?
Yeah, first of all, the national security law was something that was supposed to be enacted already since 1997. When you look at the basic law, which is the mini constitution of Hong Kong, there's Article 23 that states that the Hong Kong Special Administrative Zone, the government of Hong Kong, should enact the national security law when time is right, but before, of course, before 2047. But so they did an attempt in 2003, but there was a backlash. You had the opposition; they didn't want the national security law, and we can understand that, because they were preparing for color revolution, keeping in mind that the seeds were planted well before the handover. Before 1997, you had already the meddling. They gave a poison gift to China. They thought, oh, you know what, this is a good way just to destabilize China. But then China took time. They remember if you took the GDP of China in 1997, Hong Kong was 25% of China's GDP. So it was very big, and China was busy doing other things. They were doing reforms, opening up of the economy. And so they knew there was a problem there in Hong Kong. And I think it was extremely smart in 2019. What China did was just not to meddle, absolutely let the situation rot on purpose. So you get to a point where everything gets exposed, and you really see the motives, the evil motives. You know, when you have like the beating of mainland Chinese, it was extremely racist. You know, because there's a sense of superiority in Hong Kong, which is the whole brainwashing, colonial brainwashing, saying, well, you are from Hong Kong, you are not Chinese. And you have to beat up those mainlanders who are living in Hong Kong. You know, the Jimmy Lai, you know, is an NED agent. He was financed by the US, and now he's in jail, actually, because of the national security law. He was calling the mainlanders locusts. So China get the situation right up to a certain point where you had a huge shift of the opinion where everybody was backing the national security law. There was a petition of 3 million signatures backing the national security law. And this single element was never in the mainstream media. 3 million signatures out of a population of 7 million people. Can you imagine that? So they gained the momentum, China gained the momentum, and actually it was 3 steps. There was a national security law, and then you had a second step, which was a motion that was saying that only patriots can govern Hong Kong. So you have to pledge allegiance. But pledging allegiance is like anywhere you go in the world, you need to pledge allegiance in England to the Queen, in the US to the Constitution. So they introduced that. And third element, they had something very important was to electoral reforms. These electoral reforms made sure that the tycoons that were playing both sides, they would have much less power. So since you have the tycoons out of the picture, now Hong Kong can really have the reforms they need, you know, because there's lots of social reforms that are legitimate, that, you know, it's something that people were calling for, but they were giving the fault to China, which in reality was the tycoons, because the tycoons had their hands on the land, and so they kept the housing prices very high, and this is why there was this discontent. So it's another example of hijacking a cause. It started from social problems and was hijacked into an anti-China fight, you know, and it became very radical at the end. I'm extremely radical. So yes, this is basically, you know, this whole thing about national security law. So what Myanmar might have done, I'm speculating here, but they might got the situation right, and it was a good way just to expose. You see, Aung San Suu Kyi, she was surrounded by Western agents. There's this whole funding that was exposed. We saw George Soros Open Society. They blocked funding and they jailed 11 people because of the meddling. You had Sean Turnell, right? He was put in jail. So I suspect, I don't know what is your opinion. Do you think that maybe the Myanmar military, they did it on purpose? They let the situation rot to get to a point where they could catch the traitors and expose them. What do you think?
So, first of all, so that's a good background for the national security law, and also there were provisions there about foreign meddling, and these opposition groups and these politicians all working with foreign interests. So that was all prohibited under the national security law, correct?
You mean in Hong Kong?
Yes, in Hong Kong. Yes. And what are the penalties? What are the penalties?
You know, before the national security law, there was absolutely nothing. So you could actually establish, I mean, like NED. They had since 1997, basically China never meddled in Hong Kong. So you had people they would gather people, you know, backed by NED. They would have like forums in Hong Kong. You would have the opposition meeting with the meeting with the consulate, the U.S. consulate in Hong Kong, you would have those visits of the oppositions going to Washington. You had this meeting. It was so obvious. It was extremely obvious, and I think it was just a matter of educating people. At the beginning, 2019, people were not that educated. They didn't know what NED stood for, you know. And slowly, you had people like you. Some of your articles, they were translated to Chinese, and people started to understand. Oh, well, this is how color revolution works. But they didn't see it coming. A lot of people, they were very naive, but luckily there was a shift in perception. And I think the Hong Kong example is actually teaching. I think there's a huge impact on Thailand and Myanmar. I think it was a good way just to teach the whole region. Well, this is what could happen in Myanmar and Thailand, and maybe also you know, Malaysia and other countries.
Yes. So about the national security law and the need to educate people about the NED. If the Chinese government in the very beginning of the protests started condemning the National Endowment for Democracy and saying that they are behind all of this, I think it would have been very hard to convince the general public who are not informed about these sort of things that any of that was a bad thing, because it's called the National Endowment for the Democracy. So how could that possibly be bad? But now I think when Hong Kongers think about the NED, they think about their city on fire. And I think that is a good way to think about it, a good way to relate the NED to violent riots, burning cities, and destroyed countries, because that's what the NED actually does. Everyone on the board of directors is involved in violent regime change all around the world and wars. And you're absolutely right, because the Thai protests and now the protests in Myanmar, they have all openly linked themselves to Hong Kong through this Milk Tea Alliance gimmick, this project of the US State Department. They've all linked themselves to that. So now the entire region thinks about Milk Tea Alliance and Hong Kong and Thailand and Myanmar as just this swarm of foreign-funded and backed opposition groups just burning everything down and starting violence. It wasn't hard to convince people that the protesters in Myanmar were violent, even with YouTube and Twitter and Facebook deleting the government completely off social media and no news at all getting out of there except what the Western media reported. It was still easy for people to see that, well, the violent protests in Hong Kong and Thailand and now Myanmar, will the protests in Myanmar be the first that are actually peaceful? No way, not a chance. Yeah, go ahead.
Just Brian, just a reminder for viewers, NED stands for National Endowment for Democracy. And what NED is doing is what the CIA used to do 20 years ago. So it's just a rebranding for regime actions for regime change. I want to add something on this, is that why we using NED, it's because it's one of the platform that is the most transparent. But in terms of dollars spent for regime change is only a tip of the iceberg. I'm just giving, if you look at what NED is spending, it's 181 million per year. That's the last budget. Now look at what Soros Foundation is spending. It's 1.2 billion per year. It's almost 10 times, you know, it's 8 times more. And then you have other institutions like USAGM, which is the propaganda arm of the US. We are talking about $1 trillion US. It used to be $700 million per year. You know, there's a Radio Free Asia and so on. And now there was a last bill by Biden. I don't know if it's 200 million or 300 million, which is only on focus on the Belt and Road Initiative, how to demonize China and to create a narrative against the Belt and Road Initiative. And I'm not talking, you know, and then you have above this, you have USA 27 billion, you have the CIA 12 billion. You know, it's a fight. It's very hard to fight against this, extremely hard. You know, and it's huge. The funding, you know, I had a tweet, you know, when you look at the budget just for creating chaos around the world, you know, it's huge compared to $4 billion US that would eradicate homelessness in the US. Can you imagine that? And I think this is extremely disgusting. It's disgusting.
Yes, just the money that they spent on the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter that could have built a city on Mars and gave everyone in America universal health care. Instead, they decided to build these jets that are going to be used to bomb and kill people in their own country. It's pretty sad, and yeah, but this is why American hegemony is waning in the face of multipolarism, because the rest of the world is trying to build things, and with the media, people can see that, and I think that's why you were just talking about this huge sum of money that they are spending on undermining the region here in Asia and encircling and containing China, and it still seems like they're struggling. And now more and more people are becoming aware of this. I kind of want to get back to the national security law, and I kind of want to look at the provisions specifically about foreign meddling. Have you seen anything in the headlines about this being the national security law specifically being used against these groups? Have organizations been uprooted and kicked out? Or did they see the landscape changing and decide to voluntarily leave Hong Kong, maybe go to Taiwan or something like that? What have you seen since the law has been passed?
Well, I think a lot of organizations they've been dismantled. They were extremely deep with the U.S. meddling. If there's one thing to note, main event is that Jimmy Lai, who's the owner of Apple Daily, it's a paparazzi news which is just focusing on anti-China. And imagine is the number 2 of the company. I don't remember his name, but he is a next CIA agent. I mean, openly he's an ex-CIA agent, and he actually moved to Taiwan. So most of the activities of Apple Daily are moving to Thailand, to Taiwan, and his assets have been freezed in Hong Kong. So his assets are mainly the Apple Daily Hong Kong assets. But I think the focus of Apple Daily and what Jimmy Lai used to do is going to shift into Taiwan. And all the energy, actually, when you look at everything that the US was doing in Hong Kong is shifting to Taiwan. You even had the National Endowment for Democracy openly opening an office in Taipei. That's last year, actually. So they're preparing this. It was all linked. It's Hong Kong didn't work. Next is how are we going to hijack the politics of Taiwan and backing, basically backing one party, which is the DPP. They want the DPP, which has a narrative of independence. They are going to back that party. So it's another hijacking of democracy.
I'm just going to share the screen here real quick.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is the Taiwan Foundation for Democracy, and this is something that is directly connected to the National Endowment for Democracy. And it's just like what you're saying, just like Hong Kong was kind of the foothold. In many ways, Taiwan, too, was a foothold of the West in Chinese territory, because Hong Kong and Taiwan are both part of China. And this isn't just China saying this. This is internationally recognized under the One China policy. But so they cleared out Hong Kong. So what I suspect is going to happen is a very similar process. And actually, if you do searches for people here in Southeast Asia, especially here in Thailand, a lot of these opposition figures will actually go to Taiwan, to this Taiwan Foundation for Democracy, participate in events there. You'll see all these people showing up there, and look, and you'll see like there's always some white guy lurking around. So it says Taiwan Foundation for Democracy, but this is a project of Washington. So okay, so you're talking about that, and then Hong Kong has been more or less cleared out. Do you ever see these protests rising up again in Hong Kong?
No. There's well, you still have some elements funded by the US. I mean, one that is striking when you are in Hong Kong streets is that you still have Falun Gong. Falun Gong in the street in Hong Kong. And Falun Gong has been financed by the Open Technology Fund, which is funded by the USAGM, which is the propaganda arm of the US. So they're still accepting that. The reason is very simple. If you start to hit on a Falun Gong, the West is going to go after you and say, well, freedom of religion and so on. So, but it's harmless because the propaganda of Falun Gong is so obvious, it's so disgusting lies that people, it's just a joke in Hong Kong. It's becoming a joke. They just know, well, you know, those are lunatic, you know, and it's extremely racist. So it, you know, you still have some elements, but they got really tough. They got really tough with the, you know, I think the locals, the ones that were in the hands of the NED, they don't dare to cross the line because the penalties are very heavy, extremely heavy. But you know, when I say extremely heavy, it might still be less than what you have in the West. You know, imagine, I mean, if you are traitors, if you are now in the US and you're taking money from China for subversive actions, well, I tell you, I'd rather be in Hong Kong breaching the national security law, but not in the US.
Yes, which is a good point. I was just looking at a US Embassy website, and they had a post on how the Chinese Communist Party steals science. And there was a Chinese national just studying in the US on a visa, and they were supposed to tell someone that they were in the Chinese military while doing this visa, and they didn't, and they emailed something back to somebody in China, and they're in big trouble. I think they got detained. And so that's foreigners in the US getting in trouble for this. Could you imagine if it was an American doing this, how much trouble they would get in, and the media storm that would follow. And yet what China did is a mild version on the books in the West that have been on the books for a long time. So it's ironic, it's hypocritical, but you're saying that the national security law has made a huge difference. And I've actually heard you in another interview one time say that when the national security law was actually finally passed, this was the true moment Hong Kong actually gained its independence from the West. And people don't understand that modern day imperialism does not need to have gunboats in the harbor for another nation to have conquered you. It's the amount of influence that they have over you through any means, and through these fake NGOs, their control over education and media and political mechanisms. If they control that, they control the territory, even if de facto they have independence, supposedly after the handover. But now you're saying now they have independence truly because of the national security law. Do you really think that it's because the national security law kind of really just settled this entirely?
Yeah, absolutely. It was still colonized. You see, you have the form, you know, the 1997, you had the celebration and the handover. But if you don't restore the sovereignty, that's the problem, you know. It's this sense of sovereignty. How can you accept that you still have meddling of foreign powers? Remember, it's very easy when you're giving Hong Kong to China, but at the same time you have lots of back then was MI6 agents. I mean, they were working with the Americans already back then. You know how planting the seeds. You know, they had their hands everywhere, and but again, China, you know, the thing is that the position of China was very difficult. What if I do something? You know, the West was waiting for China to do something, and China didn't. Why? It's very simple. I think in Hong Kong, like anywhere else in South China Sea and so on, time is on the side of China. Why? Because China is prosperous, GDP is going, the economy is getting bigger, and when with time it will have a much more power. You know, it will be much more difficult to attack China. So they're just standing by on the side. You know, they don't want you. They're being passive, but slowly they will have a bigger voice on the international scene. You see the motion for Israel recently. It's very rare that China is stepping up, but it means that they want to show the world that they are being responsible, and they need to have a voice, and it needs to be proportional to the impact and the position it has in the world. So yes, the national security law, you had, before that, you had foreigners running in the streets and coaching the writers. You had this man called Brian Berletic. Grayzone did some paper about this. He had a Twitter account under the name Cuen Konggang, pretending he was Chinese. And he was basically running around. You had those videos of him telling the protesters, "Oh, you go there. Oh, you do that." And you had foreigners just teaching, protesters how to throw a cocktail Molotov.
And wasn't there evidence that he also had connections to the Hong Kong Free Press?
Oh, yeah.
Is another one of these hangouts in Hong Kong. A vector for Western propaganda and control and influence over the people of Hong Kong, serving Western interests, not Hong Kong or China's interests.
Yeah, and again, you had back then. 80% of the media were still in the hands of pro-Western. They were pro-Western media, so they hijacked the narrative. It was so blatant, fake news. You imagine we had 1 year of extremely violent riots in Hong Kong, and we didn't have a single death. We didn't have a single death. The yellow vest in France, you had 20 people died, something like this, 20 people. Many people lost their hands, they lost an eye. In Hong Kong, you had only one death, and it was because the protesters threw a stone to a street cleaner. That was a death, but they put on fire people. If you were going against them, they would beat you like really badly. So it's very funny. They used to say, well, we don't have freedom of speech, but in reality, they were the ones suppressing the silent majority freedom of speech, because we couldn't talk. The rallies, pro-China rallies we had in Hong Kong, we had to be surrounded by a lot of police, because, and we were very scared. We would have the protests in support of the police, and then we just scattered. And you wouldn't dare actually to have any, flags or T-shirts pro-China. You wouldn't, because they managed to radicalize completely the protesters.
It was kind of like that here. So when you say national security law, this wasn't just the Chinese government using the word security to kind of suppress or repress people. There was actually a real security situation in Hong Kong, and I think everybody realizes that now in hindsight, as they see through the smokescreen the Western media put up, that it was definitely a problem. There was violence and there was real fear in the streets. If you were not on their side, they would come after you. They did the same thing here in Thailand, and they openly admit they're doing the same thing in Myanmar, where if you're not on their side, they will come and get you. If you try to go to school and they're having one of their strikes, they will harass you. You don't have a choice whether to join or not. So they're saying this is all about democracy and human rights, but they're the ones that are actually trampling it. And their hypocrisy is like a little tiny version of the hypocrisy of the West that is sponsoring them and driving them. So that should be no surprise. I wanted to ask you one more thing before we start talking about how the national security law could be applied across the region. Iterations of it implemented by local governments. The national security law did a lot to restore order and to prevent this from happening again by making it law that the people responsible for this and the way that they did it, it's not going to be allowed under law anymore. Was there other things that the Chinese government and also the local Hong Kong government did to try to, if we think of Hong Kong as a game board, did they put pieces on that board to kind of rob the space from these foreign-backed agitators in terms of media, education, infrastructure, everything like that?
Yeah, there is something in terms of education. You see, the books that the kids had in Hong Kong, they were still colonial books. So they would not even teach the kids about the Opium War. Can you imagine that? I mean, even the Second World War, the Japanese in Hong Kong, it was completely distorted. So you had the books from the British era. They were still teaching the kids that the British were good guys. So they had to change that. Obviously, they had to change that, and I think it's about national security law. It's about cutting the funding, just avoiding anything which is subversive, and educating people. It's not about brainwashing. It's about telling the people, what was Hong Kong before? You didn't have democratic rights. It was a colony. You have much more rights now, and you need to teach the kids. And what when you saw those protests in Hong Kong, there were kids in the streets, and you see kids. They've been brainwashed by Apple Daily because Apple Daily was targeting kids. They've been brainwashed by their books. And you also had the unions. Actually, one of the things that happens that the unions, the teacher unions, was completely infiltrated and financed by NED. So they put some pressure on the teachers. Well, you need to teach the material we're giving you. It's over. That time where you had the books telling the kids that they were better than mainland Chinese. They were British. You had those kids convinced that they are British, and this is why at some point I had a physical confrontation with them, just saying, well, why don't you look at yourself in the mirror? You are Chinese. Why are you in this denial? Why don't you learn about history? In Hong Kong, they forget that some places in Hong Kong, dogs and Chinese were not allowed. There was what we call the peak ordinance. The peak is where the richest people, all the white people were living. Well, the Chinese could not go into the peak. You could go only if you had a special permission. Basically the maids working for the rich, British could go into the peak. So those are all things that, Hong Kong need to teach the kids. You had no democracy under British rules, absolutely no rights. Hong Kong was just stolen to China. It's part of the 100 years of humiliation. And it's important just to teach the kids. So now you have all the, this teaching and reforms. But it's taking time, and it's going the right way. It's going the right way.
Okay, so I guess to kind of wrap all of this up, we can kind of look at all of the lessons that can be learned from what just happened to Hong Kong. So you had this violence, these violent protests in the streets. This was foreign-backed. It was the NED, Open Society, all of these Western foreign organizations reaching in, trying to maintain Western influence over Hong Kong. And the Chinese government kind of let it go. They kind of let it fester in the streets so that people could see exactly what this is. Because if they acted too soon, people would think they were overreacting. They would think, oh, well, you're just suppressing these young people and their aspirations for democracy. And it wasn't until toward the end that the violence was so bad that everyone in Hong Kong and around the world could see they're lighting people on fire. They're not giving you a choice whether to join or not. The funding, the backing, Joshua Wong going to Washington, D.C., it became so obvious, so painfully obvious that people were practically begging for the Chinese army to come in, saying nothing of them wanting something like the national security law to finally put an end to this permanently. You're also saying that in addition to the national security law, there's certain fundamental things in society like education that needed to be reformed and will take a long time. So we're looking at the protests here in Thailand, these young people getting roped into this US-backed billionaire-led opposition. They're doing the exact same thing. They're trying to re-educate them, teach them to hate being Thai the way Thailand has been, and to imagine Thailand being this sort of westernized liberal foothold, or whatever it is that they're trying to put into their heads about hating yourself and embracing the West and Western ideas. And you see that in the streets, what these kids are doing. They also have this extremely anti-Chinese bend going on. And where is that coming from? Do these young people know anything about China, or is this an idea being put into their head? So for, say, the Thai government or Myanmar's government, a national security law alone is not going to fix all of this. Just saying you can't do this is not going to fix it. You also have to address the fundamentals, how the West has reached into all of these countries in the region and disfigured institutions like education, the legal system. Everything needs to get reworked to get this influence out. To educate the people of the danger. I often ask people who are kind of sympathetic toward the protests here in Thailand, I ask them, where has the US backed this sort of protest anywhere in the world and things have actually gotten better? Name one country, and what makes you think that this country is going to be the first one that succeeds? And again, look at the board of directors of the NED. So people need to be educated. And this can't just be people on YouTube doing this. This has to be a central effort by these governments looking at what Hong Kong and China did to fix this, because this isn't just a passing trend. This is the US trying to overthrow these governments and take over this region and use it against China. This is not going to end well. And they're not going to just, oh, we didn't get it this time, let's just forget about it. They're just going to keep trying until they're physically unable to do it. And so the national security law and the reforms that they're doing in Hong Kong ensure that this is not going to happen again in Hong Kong. So let's hope that the region can learn those lessons and replicate them in their own way. They shouldn't copy it, because there's certain things that wouldn't work, like in the Thai context or in Myanmar's context. But there's certain things that definitely would. So they should try to learn those lessons, I think. Is there anything else you want to add, Angelo, before we wrap this up?
No, just I think it's this brainwashing, those manipulation come in multiple forms. And again, I take the example of Hollywood. In France, after war, the USA, they forced France to have a minimum of 30% of movies which would be from Hollywood. And it was really forced. It was like, you'd better do that, otherwise you're going to have trouble. And you see there's this soft power, which goes at the very subtle level, at the subconscious level, where you get those kids in Thailand, they're watching those movies and they're like, oh, we want to be part of the free world. And that's just a facade. No matter how much we all love like Hollywood movies, but they are very subtle messages. And you have those kids trying to identify, oh, do I want to be the cool hero of a Hollywood movie, or do I want to be the non-cool Chinese? And kids, they're led by emotions. Very often, the slogans we had in Hong Kong were all emotional triggers. You are going to lose your freedom. And this is, it's not rational, and that's the power that the US have. It's this soft power, and it's very subtle, and it works extremely well. If I was a kid, I would fall into the trap. Honestly, Brian, I would fall into the trap. Me, 20 years old, I would be like, oh, I want to be a fighter for my freedom. And it's sad, it just takes a bit of time just to learn and being more rational, just looking at facts. And our work is very simple. We are against foreign interference. That's sovereignty is above everything, the most important thing. So every country needs to deal with their own problem. And what we are doing is just very simple, denouncing foreign interference. It's always about follow the money. Just our job. That's 90% of our job is follow the money, because money corrupts. And you can buy agents everywhere, in Hong Kong, in Thailand, and Myanmar.
Exactly. So one other thing I just kind of want to add to that is that China is investing a lot in infrastructure, in the economy, in things that are making a tangible difference in the daily life of everybody in China. in places like Hong Kong as well. I remember during those protests, that was right around the time they were finishing the high-speed rail station connecting Hong Kong to the mainland. And it's things like that that make it very hard for people to continue pushing this illusion. And so I think other countries that kind of want to replicate the success in Hong Kong, they need to also think about that. They need to constantly be investing in the country, building it up, giving people something tangible, because one thing these Western proxies cannot do, like the billionaire-led opposition here can never do, is actually offer people something tangible. They have all of these vague promises and things like democracy and freedom, but you can't eat that, you can't hide under it when it's raining. The government can actually build stuff. And actually, that's what the Thai government has been doing. And that's why I think the protests haven't been all that successful, because people can look and see it could be a lot worse. The government could be a lot worse. It's not nearly as bad as the opposition is saying. Even people who are on the fence can see that it's over the top and ridiculous. So I think that is important. So anyway, I think this was a good conversation. This is the first episode, the first time we're trying it this way. We'll keep working on it to improve it. I want to thank all of the people supporting us. In the video description below, I'm going to put Angelo's social media links so you can follow him. I'm not on social media. I'm not allowed. So I'll put the links to other things other places you can find me, my blog and things like that. So thank you everyone for watching, and we'll see you again next week. Angelo, any last anything?
It's always nice. It's always refreshing just to share with you. Always nice to have you.
Okay, so we'll meet again next week. Bye for now.